It was near dusk when I reached the tunnel, that long, narrow passage beneath the old railway that always seemed colder than the rest of the city. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, the kind that seeps into your coat no matter how tightly you pull it around you. The streets above were slick, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights in liquid ribbons. I had taken this route dozens of times before, but that evening the air felt heavier, as though the rain had soaked into the very bones of the world. When I stepped inside, the sound changed. The patter of rain on the pavement turned into a muffled echo, and the steady dripping from the tunnel's ceiling created a rhythmic beat that followed me deeper into the dark. My footsteps joined in, forming a strange cadence that seemed almost musical, as if the tunnel itself were breathing along with me. The light from the entrance faded behind me, and the air grew colder. I could still hear the rain above, faint but constant, until suddenly it began to grow louder. Not faint echoes or dripping, but the sound of an actual downpour. It was impossible. I was underground. There was solid concrete above my head, and yet it sounded as though a storm had found its way into the earth itself. I slowed my pace, my eyes adjusting to the dim orange glow of the old lamps that lined the tunnel walls. They flickered occasionally, buzzing softly. Each flicker seemed to sync with the rhythm of the rain, like the storm outside was in control of the lights. I kept walking, the sound of the rain growing louder still, until it filled the space around me. It was deafening now, pounding, relentless, as if the tunnel were beneath an ocean and the surface above was collapsing. I stopped walking. The sound didn't. For a few seconds I stood perfectly still, straining to hear something else. Anything else. The sound of my breathing, the drip of water, the shuffle of movement. But all I could hear was rain, heavy and close, like it was falling inside the tunnel rather than above it. A few drops hit my face. I froze. I looked up, expecting to see a leak, some crack in the concrete ceiling, but there was nothing. The surface above was dry. The drops continued anyway, cold against my skin, and as I wiped them away, my hand came back dry. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The tunnel went dark for a moment, and in that moment, I thought I saw something at the far end. A shape, small and still. When the lights buzzed back on, it was gone. I started walking faster now, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A shadow, a trick of the light. The kind of thing your mind creates when it's too quiet for too long. The rain was still there, pouring all around me, but I couldn't feel it. The sound wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be. And then, faintly, beneath the roar of the storm, I heard something else. A voice. It was impossible to tell if it was male or female. It was distant, soft, like a whisper carried through water. I stopped again, my heart pounding. The voice came again, closer this time, though I couldn't make out the words. It wasn't calling for help, but it wasn't speaking to me either. It sounded like someone talking quietly to themselves, just out of reach, just beyond the bend in the tunnel. I hesitated. The rain continued to pound above me, or below me. I couldn't tell anymore. Every instinct told me to turn around, to go back the way I came, but something about that voice pulled me forward. I walked toward the sound. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the walls sweating with moisture, the echo of my footsteps swallowed by the sound of the storm. The tunnel curved slightly to the left, and when I turned the corner, I saw it. Water trickling down the walls, pooling in shallow puddles that reflected the flickering lights above. And at the far end, the shape again. It was standing perfectly still. I stopped. The voice had stopped too. The only thing left was the sound of rain, constant and close. So close now that it felt like it was right next to me. I took a single step forward, my foot splashing softly in a puddle. The sound echoed, but the shape didn't move. I blinked, and it was gone. The tunnel was empty again. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing, just the long stretch of tunnel, disappearing into the faint light of the far entrance. I could see the end now, that small patch of gray daylight where the tunnel opened back into the street. Relief surged through me, and I started walking faster. But as I moved, the sound of rain grew even louder. The roar was deafening now, drowning out everything. My footsteps, my breathing, even my thoughts. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The noise wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the tunnel, inside my head. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, pressing in from every direction. I dropped my hands from my ears and stood there, my pulse pounding. The tunnel was still. The air hung heavy and unmoving. I took a step forward and the sound returned, faintly at first, then all at once. The rain, not from above, but from behind me. I turned around. The far end of the tunnel was gone. In its place was darkness. Not shadow, not distance, but pure black, as if the tunnel no longer had an end. The sound of the rain came from there, constant, endless, as though a storm were raging just beyond the dark. And in the darkness, I thought I saw movement, a figure, standing just out of the light. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat, the air cold and sharp. The rain grew louder, filling the space again, but I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, half-formed in the dark, the rain falling all around it. I blinked and the lights flickered once more. When they came back on, the tunnel was empty again. The rain had stopped. The world was quiet. I ran. When I finally reached the end of the tunnel, the air outside hit me like a wave. It was still raining above ground now, softly, gently, the kind of rain that should have sounded comforting. But to me it didn't. It sounded too familiar. Too close, like the tunnel hadn't let me go at all. It was just past sunset when I saw her, standing alone beneath the flickering streetlight by the old bus stop on the edge of town. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the air was still heavy, thick with that lingering scent of wet asphalt and rust. I was walking home from a late errand, the streets unusually empty, the world caught between evening and night. And there she was, waiting. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze fixed on the road that stretched ahead, a narrow, cracked strip of pavement that led deeper into the quiet outskirts. I might not have thought much of it if it weren't for the sign above her, the faded blue and white bus symbol, the one I remembered being taken down years ago. The buses hadn't run here in over a decade. At first I thought she might have been lost. Maybe she was waiting for someone, or maybe the stop just gave her shelter from the drizzle. But something about the way she stood there, so still, so patient, kept me from calling out. She didn't seem cold or hurried or even aware of the rain. She just waited. I slowed my pace as I approached, the sound of my footsteps echoing faintly in the hollow stillness of the street. The town was quiet, eerily so. Even the wind had stilled, and the soft hum of the streetlight above her filled the silence with its faint electric buzz. When I drew close enough to see her face, I realized she was smiling. Not broadly, not cheerfully, but with a faint, content expression, as though she knew something I didn't. I stopped a few feet away, hesitant. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly, not wanting to startle her. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine. They were calm, unnervingly calm. "Yes," she said after a pause, her voice soft but distant, as if she were speaking from another room. "Just waiting for the bus." I almost smiled back, unsure how to respond. "The buses don't run anymore," I said. "Haven't in years." Her smile didn't fade. "Oh, I know," she said, and turned her gaze back to the road. I waited, half expecting her to laugh, to explain, but she didn't. The words hung in the air between us, quiet and heavy. I glanced down the road where the streetlights faded into the distance. The cracked asphalt glistened under the dim orange glow, leading into a darkness that seemed far too deep for the edge of town. The drizzle picked up again, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. "Do you need help getting somewhere?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, it'll be here soon." I frowned, following her gaze down the empty road. "What will?" "The bus," she whispered. Her tone wasn't hopeful or expectant. It was certain. I stood there for another moment, unsure whether to press further or just walk away. The air felt strange, heavier now, like the world was holding its breath. I glanced again at the old timetable nailed to the bus shelter. The paper was faded, the ink washed out, but I could still make out the words. Last service, Route 17, canceled as of March 2009. When I turned back to her, she hadn't moved. Her eyes were still on the road. I followed her gaze again, and that's when I noticed it. A faint shimmer of headlights in the distance. But there was no sound, no engine, just light. Far down the road, cutting faintly through the mist. "Do you see that?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I wanted an answer. She nodded slowly. "It's right on time." I could feel my pulse quicken, a slow, creeping unease crawling up my spine. The light grew brighter, closer, but still, no sound. No tires, no rumble, no hum of machinery. Just the rain, faint and constant, and the growing brightness on the wet pavement. The bus, if that's what it was, finally came into view. It was old, the kind you don't see anymore. Its silver sides tarnished and streaked with grime. It rolled silently to a stop in front of the shelter. The headlights flickered once and then steadied. The door hissed open, though I swear I didn't hear the sound, only felt it, like a shift in air pressure. I turned to her, my voice catching. "That's not possible." They stopped service, but she was already stepping forward. Her movements were graceful, almost weightless, as she walked to the edge of the curb. For the first time, I saw her clearly. Her coat was old-fashioned, the hem darkened with rain, the fabric heavy and worn. She didn't look out of place exactly. Just out of time, she paused at the door and turned to me with that same faint smile. "You shouldn't wait here too long," she said softly. "It only stops for one passenger." And before I could say anything else, she stepped inside. The door closed and the bus began to move. Slowly, silently, it pulled away from the curb. I watched as it drove down the road, its lights fading into the mist until they vanished completely. The rain fell harder now, tapping against the empty shelter, filling the silence the bus had left behind. I stood there for a long while, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The road was empty again. No headlights, no sound of an engine, nothing. Eventually, I turned to leave, my mind still spinning. But as I passed the bus stop sign, something made me stop. The timetable, the one I'd read earlier, was different now. The faded paper looked newer, as though it had been replaced just recently. My eyes moved down to the bottom line. It read, Route 17, service resumed, night schedule only. And beside it, in faint, almost smudged handwriting, someone had written a note in pencil. For those still waiting. I stood there staring at the paper as the rain fell harder, until finally I walked away, not looking back, not once. But ever since that night, when the rain starts to fall and the streets grow empty, I swear I still hear the faint hum of a bus in the distance. And sometimes when I glance at the old stop from across the street, I can see someone standing there again, waiting patiently for a ride that never really ended. It had rained all night. One of those slow, endless rains that feels less like weather and more like time itself, dripping down from the sky. By morning, the streets were slick and quiet, the air heavy with the scent of wet concrete and rust. I left my apartment just after dawn, the world around me gray and still, every surface glistening with the remnants of the storm. The city felt older that morning. The buildings loomed, their edges softened by mist, their reflections scattered in the puddles that lined the sidewalks. I walked slowly, watching my steps, and that's when I noticed it. The reflections. At first, I didn't pay them much mind. Puddles have always been little mirrors, after all. But as I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. The reflections didn't match the world above them. The puddle nearest to me shimmered faintly, rippling in the breeze. In it, I saw the silhouette of a tall building, one with ornate arches and a clock tower that rose high into the fog. But when I looked up, there was nothing there. The space where the building should have been was empty, a vacant lot fenced off with wire and weeds. I blinked, crouching closer. The reflection stayed. It wasn't a trick of the light or a remnant of memory. It was there, solid and clear, as though the building still existed, within the puddle. I moved to another puddle, smaller this time, its edges curling around a patch of broken asphalt. It reflected a cafe, warm light spilling from the windows, a faint figure visible inside. But when I raised my head, I saw only a charred shell of what had once been that cafe, its windows boarded up, its sign faded to illegibility. The reflections were alive. I walked further down the street, drawn from puddle to puddle, each one showing something different. A bookstore that had been demolished years ago. A row of apartments I remembered from childhood before they were replaced with a parking structure. Every puddle was a window to what once stood there, each one a mirror of a city that no longer existed. It wasn't nostalgia. It was too real for that. The rainwater moved with purpose, the ripples forming patterns, almost deliberate. When I leaned closer to one of the deeper puddles, I saw movement. People walking along the reflected sidewalks, cars passing, lights flickering in windows. A reflection of life that had long since been drained from the real street above. The air around me felt colder now. The mist thickened, and for a moment I could no longer hear the sounds of the living city. No footsteps, no distant engines, no hum of electricity. Only the soft trickle of water dripping from rooftops. Then I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic sound. Footsteps, but not mine. They came from below, muffled and wet, like someone walking through shallow water. I froze, glancing around. No one was there. But when I looked down again, I saw movement in the puddle, a figure walking in the reflected street. It looked like me. Same coat, same stride. But the reflection wasn't following my movements. It was walking ahead, down the mirrored version of the road, vanishing into the shimmering outline of a building that didn't exist anymore. I straightened up quickly, my chest tightening. The puddles around me seemed to stretch wider, their surfaces rippling even though the air was still. I took a cautious step back, but the sound of footsteps below didn't fade. They grew louder, closer. Then, for a brief moment, the reflection shifted again. I wasn't looking at buildings anymore. I was looking at faces. Dozens of them, blurred by ripples, eyes open, watching from beneath the surface of the water. Some I thought I recognized. People I used to see in this part of town. The man who ran the corner store. The old woman who fed pigeons near the square. Faces I hadn't seen in years. The puddles trembled, and I took another step back. I could feel the weight of their gaze, silent and still, as if waiting for something. The wind picked up, brushing past my shoulders, carrying with it a faint sound. Whispers. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone, urgent, pleading. The reflections began to ripple faster, the buildings fading, the faces flickering in and out of view. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the water went still. The street was silent again. I looked around. The city was just as it always was, wet, gray, and empty. But when I looked back at the puddles, they no longer reflected the present or the past. They reflected me. And behind me, just barely visible in the mirrored world, were the ruins of those vanished buildings, standing tall in the world below. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street. When I looked back down one last time, the reflection had changed again. I was still there, standing in the middle of the street, but the figure in the puddle wasn't moving anymore. It stood perfectly still, staring up at me, its eyes wide and unblinking. And as the rain began to fall again, the ripples erased its face, one ring at a time, until all that was left was the gray shimmer of the water, reflecting a city that never truly disappeared. It began late in the evening, the kind of hour when the building itself seems to exhale. The faint creaks in the walls, the soft hum of unseen machinery, the distant shuffle of pipes expanding after a long day. I was sitting in the living room reading when I first heard it. The sound of water dripping. Slow, steady, deliberate. Drip, drip, drip. At first, I thought it was from the kitchen faucet. That kind of sound was ordinary enough, familiar, even comforting. But the rhythm of it was different. Each drop was perfectly spaced, unnaturally even, like a metronome ticking in an empty room. I set the book aside and listened more closely. The sound wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was faint but distinct and somewhere above me. I tilted my head toward the ceiling. Still, drip, drip, drip. I frowned. The ceiling didn't leak. It never had. I got up and crossed the room, my socks whispering against the floorboards, following the sound. It grew louder as I reached the hallway. Not much, but enough to notice. I looked up again, expecting to see some dark stain spreading across the plaster, some visible leak. But the ceiling was pristine, untouched, dry, utterly ordinary. Still, the sound continued. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from above, but not through anything. It was as though the air itself carried it. A single drop fell, not onto the floor, but through the air, mid-space, vanishing before it ever touched the ground. I froze. Another followed, descending from nowhere, a perfectly clear droplet hanging for the briefest instant before dissolving into nothing. My heart began to beat faster. I stepped back instinctively, staring at the ceiling. It was still smooth, clean, untouched, but the sound persisted. More droplets appeared, slow and deliberate, each one forming in the air, descending only a few inches before fading away entirely. I stood there for a long time listening to that rhythm. It wasn't random anymore. It had a pattern. It was too perfect. The air felt colder now, not icy, just wrong, like the temperature had shifted in a space that shouldn't change. I reached out a hand toward where the next drop should fall, and when it did, it touched my skin. Cold. Not water. Not exactly. It left no wetness behind, only a faint chill, a tingling like static electricity. I pulled my hand back, staring at the place where it had landed. My skin looked the same, but I could still feel it. That weightless, impossible drop. I should have left it at that. I should have turned around, gone back to my room, told myself it was fatigue, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I couldn't. The sound had changed again. It wasn't just dripping anymore. It echoed. The hallway seemed deeper now, longer. The sound bounced off the walls in strange ways, stretching and folding until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The light overhead flickered slightly, the shadows deepening in the corners. I took a hesitant step forward. The sound grew louder. As I moved down the hall, I noticed something odd. The ceiling was reflecting light, not from the bulb, but from within itself. The surface shimmered faintly, like a thin layer of water hovered there, invisible yet glinting with faint reflections. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, mesmerized by how the light twisted across it. And then very faintly I saw something else. Reflections, not of my hallway, but of another one. Darker, older, unfamiliar. The walls were cracked, peeling. The floor was covered in puddles that rippled with every non-existent drop. For a moment, it was as though the ceiling above me was no longer solid, but a mirror, showing a world that shouldn't exist. A hallway just like mine, but decayed, flooded, lifeless. And there was movement. Someone walked along that mirrored hall. Their steps were slow, measured, and as they moved, the dripping sound quickened like a heartbeat. I could see their silhouette clearly, but not their face. They stopped directly above me, or rather beneath me, in that upside-down place. They tilted their head as if listening. The next droplet fell, perfectly between us. It passed from the ceiling, from that mirrored world, into mine. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, and the figure began to move again, their reflection fading as though swallowed by fog. The ceiling shimmered once more, then went still. The dripping stopped. I stood there, breathless, waiting for it to return, but the silence stretched on. It was over. The light steadied. The air warmed again, slowly. The hallway returned to normal. Every shadow where it belonged, every sound accounted for. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had crossed over. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. Faint this time, almost gentle, like rain falling on a roof. But there was no storm outside. The window was dry. The sound was coming from the ceiling above me, from somewhere higher than the building itself, from the sky, indoors. It was late, far later than I'd intended to be out. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after midnight when even the air seems tired of moving. I walked quickly, my coat pulled tight against the wind, my footsteps echoing faintly on the damp pavement. There was a heaviness in the night, a stillness that felt watchful, as if the world were waiting for something unseen to pass. I turned onto my street, the familiar row of apartments stretching ahead, their windows dark except for a few faint glows from televisions or bedside lamps. My building sat near the end, an old, narrow structure with faded brick and a front light that flickered more often than it worked. I was only a few steps away when I heard it. A voice, soft, female, whispering, "Go home." I stopped. The words were clear, close, like someone had spoken them right beside me. But the street was empty. There was no one in sight. Not behind me, not across the road, not leaning from a window. Just the steady whisper of wind through the trees and the hum of distant traffic. I told myself it was my imagination, the way sound carries in the quiet. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone talking inside one of the buildings. I took another step toward my door. "Go home," the voice whispered again. This time I froze. My pulse quickened. It wasn't an echo. It was deliberate, close, almost intimate, like a breath against my ear. I turned in a slow circle, scanning every shadow, every doorway. Nothing. The rain had started to fall again, light at first, the drops scattering softly across my coat. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "I am home," I muttered under my breath. My building stood just a few feet away. I reached for my keys, my hand trembling slightly as I fumbled for the right one. The metal jingled softly, too loud in the silence. I found the key, slipped it into the lock, and paused. The whisper came again, so close now that I could almost feel the breath behind it. "Go home." But the words sounded different this time. Not warning, not kindness, just confusion. As if whatever was speaking, couldn't quite understand. The rain grew heavier, the streetlight flickering above me. I turned the key and stepped inside, shutting the door quickly behind me. The hallway was dim and narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper and the faint scent of damp wood. The silence here was deeper, almost suffocating. I leaned against the door, letting out a shaky breath. The whisper had stopped. Maybe it really was just my imagination. Maybe exhaustion had twisted some sound into words that weren't there. But as I turned to head up the stairs, I noticed something strange. The light in the hallway wasn't flickering. It was pulsing. Slowly, rhythmically, like it was breathing. Each glow seemed to fade and swell in perfect time with my heartbeat. I took a cautious step forward and the light brightened. Another step, it dimmed. I stopped at the base of the stairs. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. The building was silent. Too silent. Then from somewhere above me came the faint creak of a door opening. I froze, staring up the stairwell. One of the upper floors, 2nd, maybe 3rd, had a door that had just moved. I could see it through the railing, a sliver of darkness where light should have been. I listened, my heart hammering. Nothing. Then, a slow, deliberate footstep. I backed away. Every instinct screamed to leave, to step back outside, but my mind rebelled against it. Outside was where I'd heard the voice. Inside, at least, was home. I climbed the stairs, one slow step at a time. The air grew colder with each landing, the walls damp beneath the faded wallpaper. The dripping sound of the rain outside had followed me in somehow. Faint, steady, echoing through the building as though the roof itself were hollow. When I reached the 3rd floor, I stopped in front of my door. The gold number on it glimmered faintly in the dim light. 3B. I could see the faint outline of my reflection in the peephole, distorted, faceless. That's when I heard it again. A whisper. This time right behind me. "Go home." I spun around. The hallway was empty. My throat tightened. "I am home," I whispered. My voice sounded small, fragile. Then from behind me, from inside my apartment, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, careful, as if someone were pacing just beyond the door. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound went on for a few seconds longer, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, like the air itself was listening. I pressed my hand to the door. It was cold. I turned the handle slowly and pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, completely dark. But I could smell something, faint like rain and dust. And then from within that blackness, I heard it again. The same whisper, soft, patient. "Go home." Only this time it didn't come from behind me. It came from inside. I stepped back, trembling, and realized I was home. And something else was, too. The door began to close on its own. The whisper fading into the dark until all I could hear was the rain outside, tapping against the windows like fingers against glass. I stood there unmoving, watching the door click shut. And then, from the other side, the lock turned, slowly, firmly, sealing itself. It started as I crossed the narrow street that led toward the river. The kind of street that always felt caught between day and night, even when the sun was gone. The air was damp, heavy with mist, and the city had gone unusually still. I remember the sound of my footsteps echoing softly, the faint hum of electricity running through the power lines above. Then the first lamppost flickered. It was the one just ahead of me, a tall, old iron thing that leaned slightly to one side. The light blinked once, twice, and steadied. I thought nothing of it. Streetlights flicker all the time. But then the next one did the same, and then the next, one after another down the length of the street. Flicker, pause, steady. Flicker, pause, steady. Perfectly timed, I stopped walking. It wasn't random. It was too precise. Each light blinked in exact rhythm with the one before it, as if the entire street was communicating through pulses of light. I stared down the road as the sequence continued, each lamppost blinking in turn, the glow traveling away from me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until it disappeared into the fog. Then, after a brief pause, the pattern reversed. The lights flickered back toward me, one by one, closer. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself it was a surge in the power grid, but the timing was too perfect, like a pattern repeating itself, deliberate, methodical. I looked around. No cars, no people, not even the usual hum of the city's distant noise. Just me, the wet pavement, and the lights above, now pulsing in rhythm again. And then I realized it wasn't random flashing. The pauses were counting. 5 lights on the left side of the street, 5 on the right. They were blinking together now, pairs of lights flaring and dimming with precise synchronization. 1, pause. 2, pause. 3. Each sequence felt heavier, slower. I could almost feel the rhythm in my chest, as if the air itself had begun to move with the lights. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the nearest lamppost. It stood completely still, its glass casing reflecting the faint shimmer of mist. When it flickered again, I thought I saw something inside it. A shape, faint and fleeting, pressed against the glass. Like the suggestion of a face. I blinked hard. The light steadied and it was gone. Then all the lamps went dark. Every single one. The street fell into absolute darkness, so complete that it felt like the world had simply ended between one breath and the next. I could hear nothing but the distant dripping of water and the faint rush of wind against metal. The silence pressed against me like a physical weight. I stood frozen, waiting, staring into the black. My mind raced. Should I run? Should I call for someone? But before I could decide, the first light flared to life again. Then the next. And the next? Only this time the sequence didn't move away or toward me. It stopped, halfway down the street. The lights between me and the center glowed faintly. Everything beyond that was swallowed in darkness. The pattern started again. But this time it wasn't 5. It was 4. Each flicker sharper than the last. Each pause longer, then 3. My heartbeat quickened. I realized, too late, that whatever the lights were doing, it wasn't random. It wasn't mechanical. It was counting down. 2. The mist thickened, swirling low across the ground. The air crackled faintly, static prickling along my skin. I turned slowly, my instincts screaming to move, to get away, but my legs felt rooted. The world had narrowed to those lights, pulsing softly in the dark. 1. The last lamppost went out. For a moment there was nothing. Not sound, not light, just that thick, oppressive darkness. And then, from somewhere deep in it, came a noise. Faint, like the rustle of movement, like someone dragging a foot across wet pavement. It grew closer. I took a step back, then another. My hand brushed against the cold metal of the nearest lamppost, and as soon as I touched it, the light flared back to life. All of them did. The entire street blazed in sudden brilliance, flooding everything with harsh white light. The fog was gone. The shadows were gone. The road ahead was empty. And yet the air still felt occupied, like something had just stepped out of sight. The lights held steady now, burning too brightly, humming with power. I turned and started walking. Fast, my heart pounding, the pavement slick beneath my shoes. I didn't look back until I reached the end of the street, where the last lamppost stood silent and still. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the lights behind me began to flicker again, one by one, moving away, deeper into the fog. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then they went dark, leaving only the memory of that final, blinding glow, and the faint impression that whatever they'd been counting down to wasn't over. It had only just begun. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind that feels neither good nor bad, just gray and endless. The sky was low, swollen with clouds, and the air smelled faintly of wet dust and iron. I remember thinking the street seemed quieter than usual, though I could still hear the far-off murmur of traffic and the occasional flutter of pigeons scattering from the rooftops. I was walking my usual route, same cracked sidewalk, same faded storefronts, same sleepy emptiness that hung over the neighborhood. My thoughts were elsewhere, adrift somewhere between memory and monotony, when I almost missed it. The sound. It was faint, a low, hollow sigh, like the sound you hear when you press a seashell to your ear, only closer, deeper. I stopped walking, looked down. There was a long crack running across the pavement, one I'd stepped over countless times before. But now it looked different, wider somehow. The edges were darker, damp as though the ground had been freshly split open. The sigh came again. This time it was unmistakable, a breath. It rose up from the crack like a slow exhale, carrying a faint, warm current of air that brushed against my ankle. I froze, my heartbeat suddenly loud in my chest. The warmth was real. I could feel it, the way you feel the breath of something alive. I knelt down slowly, every instinct telling me not to. The crack stretched only a few inches wide, but it seemed to go down forever, deeper than any fracture in a sidewalk should. The concrete around it trembled softly like something beneath was stirring. And then it inhaled. The air pulled inward, quick and sharp, a sound like a gasp swallowed by earth. My jacket fluttered slightly as though caught in a breeze, except there was no wind. Just the rhythmic, steady pull of breath from below. I should have stepped away. I should have left. But curiosity, that terrible, fragile thing, held me still. I leaned closer. The warmth from below carried a faint scent, something almost organic. Soil, metal, and a hint of something sweet, like decaying flowers. It wasn't unpleasant, just strange. I whispered something. I don't even remember what. Maybe a question, maybe just a nervous sound. The breath answered. It shifted. The exhale came faster this time, louder, like a sigh turning into a shudder. The pavement beneath my hand vibrated, subtle but alive, the way a sleeping animal moves when it dreams. Then silence. The world held its breath. I straightened up, glancing around. The street was still empty, not a soul in sight. No one had seen. No one had heard. I took a careful step back from the crack. The moment my foot crossed over it, I felt the warmth vanish. The air went cold, the silence heavier. I started walking again, trying to convince myself it had been a trick, a vent, a pocket of trapped heat, the whisper of a sewer pipe. But as I turned the corner, I heard it again. Inhale, behind me. I froze mid-step, my stomach dropping. Slowly, I turned. The crack stretched farther now, just a little, but I could see it. The line had lengthened, creeping toward where I stood, as if the earth itself had shifted to follow me. The breath came again, low and steady. This time, I thought I heard something beneath it. A faint rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, deep in the concrete. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't look back until I reached my building, the door locked behind me, my hands shaking. I told myself it was nothing. Just imagination, the brain's way of making meaning out of noise. But that night, as I lay in bed, I swore I could feel something through the floorboards, a pulse, faint and slow, moving in rhythm with my own. And every morning since, when I pass that stretch of sidewalk, I walk a little faster. The crack is still there, wider now, darker. And if you stop long enough, If you listen closely when the street is quiet and the air is still, you can hear it breathing. Sometimes slow, sometimes quick, always waiting for someone to step too close again. It happened on one of those evenings when the rain feels endless, the kind that blurs the world into watercolor shades of gray and gold. The city was quiet beneath it, the air thick with the scent of wet asphalt and rust, and the sky hung low, heavy, pressing against the roofs. I had been standing beneath an awning, waiting for the light to change, watching the street shimmer with reflections. The puddles glowed orange from the lamps above, their surfaces trembling with every drop. Cars moved slowly, their headlights slicing through the mist like cautious searchlights. That's when I saw her. She stood across the street near the corner facing my direction. I remember thinking how still she was, too still, as if the rain itself hesitated around her. Her hair hung loose, dark and shining, and she wore a long gray coat that brushed her knees, but not a single drop of water clung to it. The rain fell all around her, but not on her. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a covered awning I couldn't see, or the angle of the street lamps. But there was nothing above her except the open sky. The rain seemed to slide away before reaching her, bending at the last instant, as though repelled by something unseen. The light changed. I stepped off the curb with the others, the wet air cool against my face, the sound of rain filling my ears. She began to walk too, crossing toward me. The crowd around her moved naturally, their umbrellas bobbing, their shoes splashing through puddles. But she moved differently, her pace deliberate, her stride silent, each step leaving no ripples behind. Halfway across, she looked at me. There was something in that glance. Not recognition, not hostility, but awareness. Like she'd been waiting for someone to notice. For me to notice. Her eyes caught the faint reflection of the streetlights, though I couldn't tell what color they were. I stopped walking. The light turned yellow, then red. The others hurried past, umbrellas brushing against me as they moved. I stood there, the rain running down my collar, staring at her as she reached my side of the street. She didn't rush. The water seemed to part for her, droplets freezing mid-air for the briefest second before falling again once she'd passed. The sound of the rain dimmed when she was near, not silent but softened, muted, as though the world was holding its breath. When she reached the sidewalk, she paused. We were no more than a few feet apart. The people around us walked on without a glance, as though they couldn't see her, or didn't care to. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe she wasn't real. Maybe my mind was playing tricks after a long day. Then she smiled. It was faint, almost imperceptible, the kind of smile that feels older than the person wearing it. And in that moment, the air between us felt warmer. Too warm. The smell of rain vanished, replaced by something faintly metallic like ozone. "You shouldn't be out here," she said softly. Her voice didn't rise above the rain, yet I heard it clearly, as though she'd whispered directly into my mind. "I'm just heading home," I said before I could stop myself. My voice sounded distant, like I was speaking underwater. She tilted her head slightly. "No, you're not." A chill crawled down my spine. I turned to glance behind me, at the row of buildings, at the flickering shop signs, at the glow of the streetlights in the mist. Everything looked the same, familiar. But when I turned back, she was gone. The spot where she'd stood was empty. The rain fell there now, heavily, angrily, as if making up for lost time. I stood there for a long while, the water pooling around my shoes, the city's noise creeping slowly back in. When I finally stepped forward again, the puddles reflected everything, the lights, the cars, my own blurred shape. But in one of them, just before my foot broke the surface, I saw her reflection. She was standing behind me on the other side of the street again, dry and still beneath the falling rain, watching, and even now, I sometimes see her across intersections, at the far ends of roads, in the reflection of windows after storms, always untouched, always dry, and always waiting for the rain to stop. It happened on a gray morning, the kind where the sky feels too close, and the air smells faintly of iron and rain that hasn't started yet. The streets were slick from the night before, mirrors of oil and water reflecting blurred shapes, buildings, signs, the occasional figure hurrying past. I was standing at the bus stop, watching the empty road stretch into the distance. Quiet, except for the hum of the city somewhere far away. That's when I saw it. A bus appeared at the end of the street, pale white headlights glowing dimly through the mist. It moved slowly, almost hesitantly, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. I hadn't seen one pass this early before. The route didn't usually start for another half hour. Still, I stepped closer to the curb, expecting it to slow down, to stop. But it didn't. As it approached, the world seemed to narrow. The air grew still, the drizzle stopped, and even the faint sound of the city seemed to vanish. All I could hear was the soft, rhythmic thrum of the engine and the steady slap of water under its tires. The bus wasn't new, but it wasn't quite old either. Its windows were fogged, the paint slightly faded, the number on its route display unreadable, just a glowing blur. But as it drew near, the fog on the windows began to clear, one pane at a time. And I saw them. Every seat was full. Dozens of faces pressed close to the glass. Men, women, children, all of them staring directly at me. Not blankly, not casually, deliberately. Their eyes tracked me as the bus moved, each gaze perfectly aligned, unbroken, as though every passenger had known exactly where I would be. I froze. The bus slowed, not stopping, just gliding by in an unnatural smoothness, the way things move in dreams. The driver's seat was visible for a moment, but it was empty. The wheel turned on its own. The passengers didn't move. Their faces were pale, colorless, expressionless, but not lifeless. There was something behind those eyes, something aware. As it passed, the condensation on the glass briefly clouded their faces again, and I thought maybe it was over. But then, just as the rear of the bus came level with me, I saw a small hand press against the window, a child's hand. And on the fogged glass, a single word appeared, drawn slowly, one letter at a time, as if written from inside. Wait. Then the bus was gone. It didn't drive away in the usual sense. It simply seemed to fade, its outline dissolving into the mist, the sound of its engine swallowed by silence. The air remained still for a moment longer, and then the rain started again, softly, as though nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, staring down the empty road, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd dozed off, maybe the early morning light had played tricks on me. But when I finally turned to leave, I noticed something on the ground near the curb, a faint trail of wet footprints, tiny ones. They led away from the street, away from where the bus had been, and stopped right where I was standing. I never saw that bus again, but sometimes, when the air is still and the morning fog hangs low, I hear it. The soft hiss of tires on wet pavement, the hum of a slow engine, and I don't look. Because I know that if I do, they'll all be there again, watching, waiting. I have tried in the years since to tell this plainly in words that behave and sit still on the page, but I find they tilt and slide as if the paper itself were on a slight incline. Perhaps that is fitting. It began on a night when the rain had been falling for so long that it no longer sounded like weather, but like a patient machine working in the background, a soft hiss behind everything else. I had moved into the building in late autumn when the trees out front were still holding a few leaves the color of tea. It was not a handsome building, just a practical one, with a narrow foyer that always smelled faintly of damp wool, and a stairwell that clicked and popped as if remembering the feet that had used it before. The elevator worked only when it felt like it. I lived on the 4th floor, and I liked to tell myself the stairs would do me good. The windows in my apartment were ordinary in every way I could name. Double glazed, a little cloudy at the edges, the kind that tilt inward for cleaning. I had 3 facing the street. At night, when the rain came on, they turned into soft rectangles of darkness, in which my room faintly repeated itself. The bookshelf, the lamp, the plant that refused to thrive. I was not lonely there, or not more than most. I worked a job that rode the shoulders of other people's hours. A lot of small tasks and waiting, a lot of listening, a long quiet in the afternoons. I kept the apartment tidy and set routines around myself like small fences. In the evenings, I made tea. I called my sister. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb by habit, but never by conviction. If the rain grew louder, I turned the volume of the radio down so their voices, singers and late-night hosts, would glide against it rather than fight it. This was the order of things, and for a time it held. On the night that matters, I had been reading and losing my place, listening to the rain as if it were the thread of the book, as if it could be followed to some conclusion. The lamp near the sofa had one bulb out, and the remaining bulb gave the room a soft dimness I found kind. I rose to turn on the second lamp, the small one near the television, and when I did, I glanced at the first window and felt something in my chest pause. In the glass, instead of a soft dark with the faint overlay of myself, I saw a reflection of the room as it had been earlier that afternoon, when a strip of watery sunlight had pushed through for an hour or so and laid itself across the rug. The sunlit rectangle was there in the reflection, pale gold, and since there was no sun now, since the rain had not let up in hours, I thought I was seeing some persistence of memory in the glass, as if it held on to light more faithfully than the room did. I moved nearer, thinking it would vanish once I approached, a trick of angle or of my own eyes. Up close, the reflection sharpened, the sunlight on the rug, the dust floating in the air like slow bees, the green of the plant less sullen than it ever looked at night. I raised my hand, and the reflection raised its hand, but the light did not change. I slid one palm against the cool pane and felt only the simple cold of wet glass. When I turned to the second window, it showed something stranger, a view of the street outside not as it was now, but under snow. The cars were softened white humps. The trees were crystal-ribbed. The streetlight sent a pale cone down to a world softened to silence. I do not know why, but the sight steadied me. It was wrong, certainly, but it was not violent. It was as if the window were remembering a winter I had not yet lived. I thought of chalk diagrams on blackboards, of time drawn as a line and then as a loop. I thought this and did not allow my heart to hurry. The third window, the one nearest the kitchen, showed rain, yes, but not this rain. In that reflection, the drops were fat and slow, clinging to the glass as if reluctant to fall, and the street was scattered with umbrellas. A child in a yellow coat dragged a stick along the curb, carefully stepping over each puddle while the actual street outside my building, when I leaned between the frames to check, was empty and thoroughly drenched, no umbrella in sight. I stood there a long time, my forehead nearly touching the cool pane, listening to the real rain and watching the old or future or other rain in the window. The window did not cloud with my breath. I took that as a small mercy. I wanted to see. I did not phone anyone. It is important that I say this. There is always the urge to call a witness into an oddness, so the oddness can be halved or traded. But I stayed alone with it, because the shape of it felt too delicate for interruption, like a thought that would flee if named too loudly. And I admit, too, that I wanted to keep it. I felt something in me lean in toward it the way a plant leans toward light. I made tea and set the cup on the sill and stood there like a person at a train station waiting for a particular train that might or might not exist. It did not stop with weather. That was merely the first thing my mind could recognize. In the hours that followed, while the apartment held its hush and the rain went on, the windows offered other small rearrangements. In the snow window, I watched a set of footprints appear, one by one, in the powder on the sidewalk, though I never saw the feet that pressed them in. In the sunlit window, a moth drifted lazily through the air, which made me smile because in my actual room, moths meant I had been careless about clothes in summer, and I had not worn summer clothes in months. In the window with umbrellas, someone left a red scarf knotted to the fence opposite the building, as if it had been found and gently reclaimed. Meanwhile, the actual world outside my building kept its simple, unstoppable reign. The gutters chuckled and muttered. Somewhere, a drain pipe clicked with the sound of its own expansion and shrinking. A car went by, and later a bus, and then much later the quiet stride of a single set of shoes on the wet sidewalk. In my windows, time seemed to loosen. I watched a morning sun butter the building opposite, and a breezy spring carry newspaper pages along the curb. I watched, in one reflection, the sky grow deeper at the edges, smudged with the promise of a storm, and then, while my clock insisted it was only just past midnight, that reflection cleared into a bright and ordinary afternoon, as if the weather itself were no more than a breath held and released. There were sounds, too. I want to be precise about this. It is easy to ascribe voices to old buildings, to hear complaints in their bones, but these sounds did not come from the walls or the pipes. They came, as far as I could tell, from within the glass. The umbrella window murmured with the low talk of people passing by, sensible phrases never fully caught, the way a cafe sounds when you are just outside it. The snow window made a sound like felt sliding against wood. The sunlit window, when I pressed my ear toward it, held a faint buzzing, not electrical, more like summer insects far off. None of the sounds were large or insistent. They were small and polite, like neighbors doing their own business behind thin doors. It would be easy now to arrange this into an explanation. Dreams, griefs, patience worn thin. But that night I felt oddly, fiercely ordinary. I washed a plate. I wiped a counter. I looked at the windows as if they were beehives, and I was the kind of person who stands a respectful distance away. And yet, as the hours lengthened, a different kind of attention crept in. It happened in small disturbances that could be overlooked if I wished, and I did wish for the most part, because I could feel the edges of something too large for me. A book I had left on the coffee table was not quite where I remembered placing it. The plant near the first window seemed to have turned its leaves toward light that did not, in my room, exist. The clock above the stove lost 6 minutes and then found them again without my hand. When I put my palm to the second window, I felt the chill of imagined snow under the glass. And when I withdrew my hand, the skin smelled faintly of something clean and cold, like wind. Hours passed, the hour hand crossing the same small landscape over and over. I stretched out on the sofa with a blanket and told myself I would rest. I did not sleep. That would be untrue. I came near it, floated against it. The rain became the nearest thing I had to a heartbeat. The windows, if they had been a choir, kept their parts in a low undertone, no voice pushing forward, nothing trying to make itself a question. I might have stayed that way all night if not for a very simple and unkind thing. The sound of a door down the hall on my floor, opening and closing with slow care. I knew that sound. My neighbors were quiet people and the doors were heavy. But this sound was followed by a pause and then by footsteps that did not move away from my door or toward the elevator. They stood. The rain pressed its hands against the building. The footsteps stood, and I had the sensation that whoever owned them was looking up at the windows from the street side, though that was not how the building was arranged at all. It was an odd feeling, and as soon as I thought it, it seemed absurd enough to make me smile, and I held very still like a child pretending to be asleep. I do not know how long that lasted. It may have been a minute, or it may have been a series of minutes that all had the same shape. Eventually, the footsteps went on, and the quiet of the building returned to me like a small blanket that had slipped and been pulled up again. I told myself not to be dramatic. I told myself there were others living here, each with their own lists, their own tiredness, their own late-night errands. The windows, unbothered, continued. In the umbrella window, the red scarf remained tied to the fence, rain beads threaded along its edge. In the snow window, the footprints had filled a little with new snow, softening. In the sunlit window, the light shifted across the floor as if clouds were passing, though the cloud sound in my room was steady and patient. By then I understood in the way the body knows a staircase in the dark, that the windows were not misbehaving glass but openings to a series of rooms that belonged to me and did not belong to me. I was not seeing new weather only. I was seeing other rooms where my furniture sat a little differently, where the plant did or did not thrive, where a red scarf might be something I once owned or had yet to own. I thought of the phrase possibility space, which I had read in some essay and not forgotten. The idea did not frighten me then. It loosened something in my chest. I thought of versions of myself who had set the clock a little higher on the shelf, who had bought the other lamp at the store, who had learned to cook the recipes I kept meaning to try. I imagined them moving about their evenings with the rain's hand on their windows, as it was on mine. The twist, if we need to call it that, came gently. The snow window, which had been content to offer its steady whiteness, began to show with unhurried clarity a figure standing at the curb. It was a person in a dark coat, their face shadowed by a hood or hat, their shoulders squared against cold. There was nothing remarkable about them except for the feeling they brought with them, like a set of keys forgotten and then remembered at once. They were not looking at the building. They were looking at the window. They were looking at me in the glass. At first, I took the posture to be a coincidence, an alignment of angles. But when I stepped a little to the right, they followed with their gaze. When I lifted my hand, they did not mimic the lift the way a reflection would. Instead, they did something smaller and more human. They made a slight motion with their chin, as if to acknowledge an acquaintance across a room. It was the smallest, politest thing. I stood there with my palm flat on the pane, and I felt an old emotion I had not felt since childhood, the sense of being seen by something in which I had not believed. I did not run from the window. That would have broken whatever careful courtesy had been built between us. I only stood and breathed and felt my pulse in my throat. The figure did not move closer. They waited. In the umbrella window, a bus went by and the red scarf flapped a little. In the sunlit window, a moth settled on the screen and slowly opened and closed its powdery wings. In the room with rain where I truly stood, I heard faintly 2 distinct taps somewhere below, as if a neighbor had set a cup down and picked it up again. When I turned back to the snow window, the figure lifted a hand as if to try the air and then lowered it again. And in that motion I sensed not threat but a kind of patience, which was worse because it could be extended as long as the rain, as long as night itself. I could have closed the curtains, but I did not own curtains, only blinds I rarely used. I could have turned the lamps out and relied on the rain's soft cover, but the dark would have made my mind louder. Instead, I did the domestic thing, the ordinary, humbling, kindly thing. I washed the cup I had used for tea and set it on a towel. I folded the blanket. I watered the plant a little, not much, because I did not want to drown it. I did all this while the 3 windows watched me in their separate weathers, and the figure in the snow window waited with their careful chin lift that said, "I know you know." When I could not pretend to have chores remaining, I stood in front of the first window, the sunlit one, and tried to see what else my mind had been missing. The rug's nap lay in smooth direction under the light, and the book on the table had a ribbon in it I do not own, and the plant's leaves had a small tear along one edge that I had never noticed, and then, after a moment of looking, noticed on my actual plant as well, a thin brown line like a healed cut. The smallness of that convinced me more than the snow person did. The life of it, the daily, the real. Later, and I cannot say when because the clock had ceased to feel authoritative, I fell into sleep. Not proper sleep, but the kind that slides over the eyes like a hand. This did not happen on the sofa, as one might expect. I lay down on the rug. I had the idea that if I made myself a horizontal creature there, I would be at the level of the windows, as if the glass were lakes and I were a creature at their edge. I thought if I could make my breath gentle enough, I might hear the other rooms better. I lay there, and the rain laid itself alongside me, and the building made the soft throat-clearing noises old buildings make when the temperature shifts, and the windows hummed along in their 3 keys. The last thing I remember before sleep took the corners of my mind was the figure in the snow lifting one hand, not exactly in greeting, but in a test, as though measuring the air between us and then letting it fall again. When I woke, the room was dimmer, but not because the rain had thickened. Rather, the lamps were paler, as if their light had thinned in the night. Outside, actual dawn had not yet earned the right to call itself morning. My mouth felt coated with the taste of infusions, the ghost of tea, the cool of water. I rose and checked the kitchen clock and found it honest again, which made me laugh in my head. And then I went to the windows, because by then I was committed to letting their logic replace my own for a while. The umbrella window showed a street washed clean, the red scarf gone. A woman jogged by without a hat, her breath not visible, which told me the air there was warmer than mine. The sunlit window wore a quieter light, as if it were early in the day there and I had not yet turned on any lamps. The book with the ribbon lay unattended, which made me want to step into that room and rescue my place. The snow window, which had become the window I approached with caution, was not white now. It showed a grayness, the color of a sky just before the first flakes fall. The figure was gone. Their absence had a shape, and I felt it like a draft. It would have been the easiest thing then to declare the episode concluded, to call it a night of strangeness, to be grateful for its gentleness, and to set about making coffee and a list for the day ahead. I considered that path and I admired it. But something had been opened in me, and I felt a responsibility not to close it with the slap of a morning's routine. I had the feeling one might have after hearing a person say something unexpectedly honest in a casual conversation. I could not pretend it had not been said. So I stood at the first window and watched the moth in the sunlit room find the corner of the frame and settle there, and I mirrored it with my own small stillness. It was in that posture that I realized something I had missed. The moth's shadow fell the wrong way in the reflection. There was a second light source weaker than the sun somewhere behind it. I turned in my own room to see if any of my lamps could explain it, but the angle was wrong. When I looked back, the second light had strengthened. Not in my room, but in the reflection, and I saw, far back in the glass, another window, a window within the window through which the pale square of another room, not mine, wavered like a distant room seen through heat. It was an odd sense. The glass did not end with me. It was a corridor. I put my hand to the pane and felt the old, faithful cool. The corridor remained. Behind me, the kettle clicked, having reached its point and then stopped. To this day, I wonder if it began earlier, and I only learned to look now. Perhaps the windows had always been their layered selves, and I had been too fixed in my first meaning to see. The corridor of rooms in the glass was quiet. I could make out shapes in those far squares, chairs, shadows, a picture frame, but not faces. I had a feeling, unhelpful and certain, that faces were there, only relocated by one step to the left of where I thought to look. A small human stubbornness rose in me then. I wanted to catch one looking. I stood like a person waiting beside a non-functioning elevator, willing it to descend. My arms grew heavy, and my back pricked, and the kettle cooled, and the rain maintained its patient work. When I finally let my shoulders soften, the snow window offered its own corridor, a narrower one that cut sideways, like the view down a long, narrow street. And there, at last, not in the sunlit corridor, but in the gray one, a movement resolved into a person stepping near to the window from far back. The sensation of being watched returned so suddenly that my breath shortened, not in panic exactly, but in an instinctual economy, small sips, measured evenly. It was an old woman, though old is a word that gathers all sorts of leaves to itself. She had the kind of old that is partly posture and partly the way time sits on a face. Her hair was white in that corridor light, and her mouth had the patient curve of someone who has listened a great deal and spoken just enough. She came near, not too near, and looked at me the way one looks through a peephole, not suspiciously but entirely focused. I am ashamed to say that tears came to my eyes because the expression on her face was not fear, not surprise, but recognition. And that recognition was not of me as I had been that day, or of me as a shape in a window, but of me as one recognizes an old photograph of oneself taken at a party one barely remembers, a gentle acknowledgement, a soft grief for what can't be held. She lifted her hand. I lifted mine. She held hers steady as if testing a pain she had pressed before. Then she did something I have tried to describe accurately to anyone who has asked. She smiled not at me but at a point just behind me and nodded once, a private sign, compassionate and final. I turned my head carefully, unwilling to break whatever was being offered by moving too quickly, and saw nothing but the long, simple room of my life. The sofa, the rug, the plant faithfully pretending to flourish. When I turned back, she had stepped one pace away, not vanishing, just easing back into the corridor. I had the impression, ridiculous and specific, that somewhere a kettle was clicking in her room too, and that she was letting it wait. I do not know what one does after that. I made coffee. I drank it too quickly. I put on a sweater, though I was not cold. I moved around with small purpose, my mind full of that nod directed to a point beyond me. If the building had started to hum or speak then, I would have accepted it. It did not. Instead, in the umbrella window, a child appeared with a string, walking the string as if it were a pet. In the sunlit window, the moth traveled the edge of its lit world, a small pilgrim who knows only the geometry of frame and screen. In the snow window, the corridor remained, but slid out of view as if turning, showing me only the ordinary scene of a street expecting weather. Eventually, of course, morning had to claim the room. The true light came shyly, the kind that makes everything look a little unreliable, The radio, when I turned it on, had an early program in which a woman read the weather as if it were poetry. Scattered showers, intermittent clouds, and the sound of her voice laid itself over the window, hummed the way a hand closes around a pulse. I told myself I would go to work. I told myself I would take the stairs. I told myself I would, at some point before noon, find curtains. I believed each of these statements in turn. I was tying my shoes by the door when a small pattern in the hallway presented itself to me. A sequence of damp footprints, the kind that come from shoes left near weather, beginning in front of my door and leading away toward the far stairwell. They were faint. They were nearly the size of my own foot. The apartment across from me had a doormat printed with a small row of trees, and the prints overlapped the trees in a way that made them look like shadows of shadows. I bent and touched one which was already fading and felt only the coolness of stone. I do not think much of that even now. People come and go. But I noticed as I rose that the prints were not oriented toward the elevator or the nearer stairs, but toward the far stairwell, which had a small window on its landing that looked down into the tiny internal courtyard. It was a place I rarely went because the lights there clicked off too quickly and the stairwell smelled of old leaves. I followed the prints, not because I am brave, but because I am obedient to patterns. The far stairwell window had the kind of glass that is faintly pebbled, meant to let in light but blur out specifics. Through that cloudy pane I could see the courtyard and the opposite side of the building, and the lower row of windows that corresponded to the apartments below mine. The rain had made everything in the courtyard gleam a little, like a photograph printed on glossy paper. I pressed my hand to the pebbled glass and felt the coldness of ordinary morning, which almost disappointed me. But then, through the ripple of that cheap glass, I saw movement in the window that would have been directly under my sunlit room. It was not dramatic, just a shape adjusting itself from a seated posture to a standing one. I could not make out the person clearly. My mind tried to supply the old woman, but the outline did not match. It looked like someone my age or a little older, moving in the mild way people move when they have been sitting too long. The room beyond was lit with a light that could have been sun or could have been simply better bulbs. I watched for a time that is hard to name. Outside, the rain made small ticking sounds against a metal gutter. The stairwell light clicked and, after a measure, clicked off, and I stood in the dim, content with the small gray that remained. I heard someone enter the building below and ring a bell, and then, a moment later, leave again without being let in. These were the facts. They sat plainly on the surface of the morning, and somewhere beneath them, like a slow river under ice, the other facts moved. The corridor in the windows, the figure on the snowy curb, the nod to the space behind me. When I returned to my apartment, the windows behaved themselves. They showed me only what one would expect. Rain on glass, the opposite building's pale bricks, my room repeating itself faintly in the late morning light. I had the sudden urge to apologize to them, which made me laugh aloud. I made the bed, though it did not need making, and opened the fridge and closed it without taking anything out, and stood for a while with my hand on the back of the chair, as if I were a person about to deliver a speech to an audience that had not yet arrived. Then I gathered my bag and put on my coat, and, after a small hesitation, turned the blinds so that the slats were half closed, not to shut the windows away, but to allow them their privacy. In the days after, the building went on being a building, which is one of the reasons I have come to trust it. The elevator continued its private war with gravity. The hallway bulbs burned out one by one and were replaced on Tuesdays by a man with kind eyes and a step that made no sound even on the creakiest boards. My plant rallied, then sulked, then rallied again, which I decided to take as good news. I did not try to recreate the night. I did not sit vigil by the panes or pour tea for the reflections. But sometimes, when the late afternoon turned the room a gray like the inside of a seashell, and the rain was performing its patient work, I would look up and find one window holding a weather that was not ours, and I would accept the small offering without fuss. The umbrella would appear again, the red scarf tied in a better knot. The snow would arrive early on that other street and settle into its work. The sun would drag its pale coin across the rug, and the moth would return to trace its quiet route. What unsettles me most even now is not what I saw, but what I began to hear in the days after, in that hour between dinner and the first thought of sleep. when the apartment's noises arranged themselves like furniture settling. If I sat quietly with the radio dim, sometimes a voice would appear in the low murmur that comes with old wiring and other people's televisions, a voice that did not belong to my building's set of voices. It was never speaking to me directly. I was more eavesdropper than addressed. It said everyday things in a tone that made me trust it. About a kettle, about a plant, about a window that had begun, on a certain rain-soaked night, to remember more than one weather at once. It spoke about a figure in a coat on a snowy curb, and the lift of a hand and the patience of corridors. It mentioned a nod to a space behind them that had no furniture and yet was full, and each time I heard it, I would tell myself that the voice was only my own thoughts performing a new trick, that the mind loves repetition, that the brain will find patterns even in static. And yet the voice sometimes said a word I do not use for the thing it named, a ribbon for a bookmark, a drawing room for a living room. And this difference had the gentlest force. I could not make it be only me. The last thing I will tell you is the part that keeps me from concluding neatly. A week or so afterward, on a night when the rain was absent and the city had the particular quiet of after-storm air, I woke around 3 with the light knowledge that I had been dreaming, though the dream receded as water does between the stones. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and did not turn on the lamp. The windows were dark and simple, showing me only faint repetitions of myself and the room. I stood there with the glass in my hand and let my eyes blur, the way one does to make a room kinder. And then, in the glass, in the reflection of the first window, the sunlit one, I saw, just for a breath, nothing long enough to insist upon, nothing I could photograph or point to with a learned finger, the shape of a person walking across my room. They were not a thief or a ghost. They were simply a person moving through a space they knew well. They were carrying what looked like a small folded blanket. They paused at the rug's edge and looked up at the window as one does to measure the weather before planning the day, and the expression on their face had the attentive calm of someone who has been awake for a while already. I could not see them in the room itself. They were only in the window, and in the window they were absolutely present. They did not look like me, not exactly. They were neither older nor younger in any reliable way. If I had to say anything, I would say they looked like someone I might become if I paid more attention to the quiet things. They stood there a time and then continued on. And by the time I remembered to breathe, the window had returned to its ordinary work of repeating my kitchen and my late-night face and the curve of the lamp I had not turned on. In the morning, I found the plant had sent out a new leaf, small and pale and folded like a hand. The radio spoke of the week ahead in terms that were not promises but invitations. On the street, the puddles had dried to faint stains. I went about my day with respect for the doors I passed through and the windows I did not look into and the rooms I would never enter. Since then, on nights when the rain returns and lays its steady hand on the building, I look up at the windows and let them hold what they will. I do not call out and nothing calls my name. Still, sometimes in the light that comes when a lamp is turned off and a mind is not yet turned on to sleep, I see, not in the window but in the space just behind me, the shape of a nod meant for a person I cannot see, and I feel sure that somewhere, in a corridor of rooms arranged like a polished spine, a version of me is standing in a different weather, looking into a different glass, listening to the same soft rain, and writing perhaps these same words in a careful hand on a page that keeps tilting and tilting, as if the house it rests in is forever on the most patient of inclines. It was raining again that evening. Not the fierce kind that lashes at windows and makes you feel trapped, but a softer rain, a curtain of steady sound that made the air smell clean and distant. I'd gone out with my umbrella mostly to quiet my mind. The streets of the old district had that silvery glow they get when every surface reflects light. The cobblestones, the puddles, the empty shop fronts long after closing. I liked walking there because the rain made the city seem almost polite. Its noise gentled into whispers. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the street, under the yellow light of a tilted lamppost, her umbrella tilted just enough to hide her eyes. The hem of her dress swayed lightly in the breeze. Not white, not black, something in between, like faded smoke. There was nothing special about her, not at first, except the stillness. Everyone else hurried under the rain, heads down, shoes splashing, but she stood there as if waiting for the world to catch up. And then she smiled. It wasn't a wide smile or one meant for attention. It was the kind of small, private smile people wear when remembering something tender or secret. The kind that makes you feel you weren't supposed to see it. I slowed down without meaning to. There was no reason for the unease that came next. She was just a woman beneath an umbrella, but it was like the sound of the rain shifted slightly around her, softening into a rhythm I couldn't quite match. She looked up once, briefly, and though the distance between us was long, I could swear her eyes met mine. A car passed between us, its headlights scattering water into silver threads. When it was gone, the spot beneath the lamppost was empty. The umbrella was still there, tilted, dripping, but she wasn't. I stopped walking. For a long time, I just listened to the rain tap against that forgotten umbrella, the sound hollow and delicate, like fingers brushing the strings of an unseen instrument. Something in me said to leave it, but something else, a smaller, quieter instinct, said to look. So I did. When I reached the umbrella, it was still open, resting upright, balanced unnaturally on its handle as if someone had planted it into the stones. Beneath it was dry ground, perfectly dry, a neat circle untouched by the rain. I waited for it to fall over. It didn't. The air beneath it felt still. The smell of rain vanished, replaced by something faintly metallic, and then softly a whisper, not from behind or around me, but from under the umbrella itself. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone, like someone trying to comfort a child through tears. I crouched, my hand shaking as I reached toward the fabric, and the whisper stopped. Only silence and the hum of distant thunder. I hesitated, then lifted the umbrella. Nothing. No one was there. Just the stones and the steady rhythm of rain returning to the spot it had missed. But the whisper didn't fade from my mind. It seemed to have slipped somewhere inside me. I carried the umbrella home, telling myself it was because leaving it there would be littering. But I knew that wasn't true. I wanted to understand it. The stillness, the voice, the impossible dryness beneath it. I leaned it near the door and tried to ignore the faint drops that slid from its edges onto the floor, though somehow, even after an hour, the handle never dried. That night, I woke up to the sound of rain again, not outside, but inside the room. The sound was soft, localized, like a leak tapping the same rhythm endlessly. I sat up and realized it was coming from the umbrella. It was open. I hadn't opened it. It stood in the middle of the room, its canopy glistening faintly, though the ceiling was perfectly dry. Beneath it, and I swear this is true, the floor was dry again. I stared at it for what felt like an hour. The air smelled like rain-soaked stone and a faint perfume. Something floral, something old. And then came the whisper again. Closer this time, clearer, though still blurred at the edges like a voice underwater. I could almost recognize the words, "Don't leave me." It's still raining. I froze. The whisper seemed to move slightly as if circling the inside of the umbrella. My chest tightened with a fear I couldn't place, not of being hurt, but of being remembered by something I didn't understand. I forced myself to stand, crossed the room, and folded the umbrella shut. The whisper stopped immediately. But before the silence settled, I thought I heard a sigh. The next morning, I took the umbrella outside and left it by the park bench near the old stone bridge. I didn't look back. I told myself it would stay there, that someone else might take it, and the strange mood that came with it would end. But that evening, when I came home, wet from the rain I hadn't expected, the umbrella was standing again by my door, dry, upright, waiting. I left it there for days, too afraid to touch it, too ashamed to throw it away. Each night I thought I heard faint drops somewhere inside the apartment, as though the rain had followed me home in the air, collecting itself under the fabric I refused to open again. The sound was soothing in a way that frightened me, soft, steady, like someone breathing quietly in their sleep. Eventually, I began to speak to it. Just small things. Good night, good morning, the kind of absent words people give to the empty spaces of their lives. I think I half expected it to respond, to whisper something back from that strange hollow world beneath its canopy. But it didn't, not until last night. The whisper came again, gentler than before, and it said my name. I hadn't told anyone here my name yet. I had just moved, just begun. But the voice knew it, and it said it the way someone says a memory, tender, uncertain, as though tasting the sound. I stood by the door for a long time, watching the umbrella and listening to the rain against the windows. When I finally lifted my eyes, I caught my reflection in the glass, and for a moment, I wasn't alone. A figure stood beside me in the reflection, her face calm, her smile small and secret, like the one I'd seen under the lamppost. She held the umbrella over us both. I could see the rain streaming down its sides, but outside, the sky was perfectly clear. I turned, there was no one there. The umbrella remained folded, still dripping onto the mat, though it hadn't seen rain in days. Now, every night, I hear the faint rhythm of raindrops again, no matter the weather. It always begins softly, from the umbrella by the door, the one I can't bring myself to throw away. And sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I think I see her shape standing beside it again, smiling gently beneath it, waiting. And though I tell myself it's just the memory of rain, I never look twice. Because every time I do, the umbrella is always open, and always empty. I still don't know when the city truly fell silent. It wasn't sudden. It was as though the noise simply forgot to return one morning. The first thing I noticed was the absence of traffic. Not the complete kind of absence that would alarm you, just a pause, like the world had stopped mid-sentence. Even the usual late-night hum, that endless undercurrent of engines, seemed to dissolve into the air. I thought it was the weather. The rain had been falling since before dawn, and the clouds pressed so low that buildings looked shorter, as if bowing to it. But the rain didn't sound right either. It was too steady, too rhythmic. It fell in measured intervals as though someone were controlling its pace. I remember thinking that the city felt like it was listening, waiting for something to answer. I lived on the 6th floor of an old apartment block near the river. When the rain started, it usually brought comfort, that white noise that makes you feel small but safe. That morning, though, it carried something else. It wasn't until I stood by the window that I realized what it was. Somewhere beneath the hiss of rainfall, I heard my name. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the echo of a memory, perhaps. I'd been lonely lately, cut off by my own choosing. But there it was again, faint, stretched thin across the distance between rooftops. Akib. It came like a breath through the rain, soft and patient, and then faded. I waited for it to come again, to prove itself real. The city, however, offered only silence, as though holding its breath. The next day, the streets were empty. The lights still changed from red to green, but there were no cars to obey them. I walked through the center, and my shoes made the only sound, except for the rain. The rain was louder than before, and every drop seemed to land where my thoughts were. When I passed the old clock tower, the bells didn't ring at noon. Instead, I heard the faint sound again. Closer this time. Akib. I turned sharply, but there was no one there. Just rain and the sound of my heartbeat echoing off wet stone. I tried calling out once, "Hello?" But the word didn't carry far. It fell flat, swallowed immediately by the damp air. That's when I realized the city wasn't just quiet. It was hollow. My voice had no place to go. I went back home. The stairwell smelled like wet plaster, and my footsteps sounded foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. I tried to distract myself, turned on the radio, the kettle, anything, but none of it worked. The radio gave only static. The kettle hummed too softly. The rain was louder, always louder. When night came, I sat by the window again. The buildings across the street were dark, their glassy eyes closed. The rain traced long, delicate lines down the panes, and somewhere within that soft percussion I heard it again. Not distant this time, but near. Akib. It came from below my window, maybe from the street, maybe from somewhere deeper. I opened the window slightly, and the cold air crept in, smelling of iron and wet concrete. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't calling. It was repeating, whispering my name again and again, each time softer, as if learning how to say it. I closed the window and stepped back. The whisper didn't stop. It was no longer coming from outside. That night I didn't sleep. Every sound in the apartment became suspicious. The creak of the floor, the drip in the kitchen, the hum of the pipes. Somewhere in that fragile orchestra, the whisper kept weaving itself in, calling my name with aching patience. By the third day, I began to notice something stranger. When I spoke, even quietly, the rain would falter just for a moment, as though it were listening, testing. I started whispering back. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. Maybe to prove that I was still real in this place that seemed to be forgetting what noise was. Each time I said something, even a single word, the rain changed. Its rhythm bent, slowing or quickening, responding like breath. I told myself I was imagining it, but the part of me that still believed in logic had been thinning with every passing hour. That evening, I walked again through the city center. No people, no lights, only rain and the muffled reflections of my own shape in the shop windows. I thought I saw movement once, a figure in a coat, half hidden beneath an awning. But when I approached, there was only an open umbrella lying on the ground, dry beneath its canopy. I didn't touch it. The voice came again, nearer now, somewhere behind me, within the rhythm of falling water. Akib. The sound was not a whisper anymore. It was an echo, the kind that repeats itself not through air but through memory. I began to walk faster. The rain matched my pace. Each step sent the sound skittering around the corners of buildings, calling my name in softer and softer tones, until it no longer sounded like a call at all. It sounded like someone trying to remind me of something, the way a friend's voice does in a dream you forget upon waking. When I reached the bridge, the river below was black and motionless, though the rain struck its surface constantly. I leaned over the railing, and the echo of my name rose from the water like mist. Akib! And for a moment, just a heartbeat, I thought I saw something below. A ripple that didn't belong to rain, the faint outline of a face looking up. My own face. I don't remember leaving the bridge. I only remember waking the next morning in my bed, my clothes still damp, my shoes by the door. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. But now, it no longer whispered. It hummed, quietly, continuously, a sound almost like breathing. It has been weeks now. The city remains silent. I don't see anyone, but I feel watched, gently, persistently. The rain never ceases. It follows me from room to room, though the windows are closed. Sometimes it forms words against the glass, faint trails that vanish when I blink. I can almost read them, but not quite. Every night before I sleep, I hear the same echo, distant but faithful. Akib. It doesn't sound like it's calling me anymore. It sounds like it's remembering me, repeating my name in case I forget who I am. Sometimes, when the silence is deepest, I whisper back, just to hear something that answers. And when I do, the rain outside softens, almost tenderly, as though relieved. But tonight, I noticed something new. When I said my name aloud, softly testing the air, the rain didn't echo it back. It repeated another name instead, and it was mine, but said the way a stranger would say it.